Got it. All right, good. Welcome to Wild Connections, another webinar. This one also on climate change, very relevant subject. I'm Claude Newman, a longtime board member, as is Allison, who introduced herself on Wild Connections. And we're a small organization, soon to have 2 employees and a bunch of volunteers. We're dedicated to preserving and protecting wildlands for native species and biodiversity. On the Pike San Isabel National Forest, kind of the center of it, in the Arkansas and South Platte drainages. So we work through advocating and restoration and education to try and expand those lands that we need so badly for the free movement of wildlife and protect what we do have. Tonight, returning is Dr. Karl Ford. Karl is a longtime, or a rather former longtime board member of Wild Connections, and he is a scientist, a biologist. He worked for the BLM for many years, and his specialty, or one of them, is kind of climate change, and he'll be talking about his second book, and I assume that's published or will be soon, on the Colorado Trail in Crises, a field report on climate change and mountain ecosystems. So I'm gonna give it over to Karl, and I don't think we have visual of Karl, just audio. Is that right? Karl?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Trying to share my screen here.
Okay, we see
Okay, can everybody see that?
I can.
So thanks everybody for tuning in, as Claude said, and thanks Claude for the little intro. Um, I was active in Wild Connections for several years, left the board a couple of years ago. I am a retired environmental scientist from BLM, as he mentioned. I am a long distance hiker, and I have completed the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, which together forms the triple crown of long distance hiking. I also have done the Colorado Trail twice. I did it once in about 2008, I think, and again finishing in 2021. And in my visit on the trail last time, I saw a lot of changes and changes in the ecosystems, which I want to talk to you about. And all of this is in my book. The book is published and it is available. I have copies in my possession. You can also order from UP Colorado. That's the University Press of Colorado. And they used to have this discount code. I don't know if it's still available, but I'll talk more about, if you want to get a hold of the book, how you can get it. There's some other options. So basically, it's a story of the hike in one level, starting basically at Barton Canyon near Denver and finishing up in Durango. It's about 500 miles of alpine hiking. Probably half of it's above tree line. It's just incredibly beautiful. And on another level, it's a story of the science related to climate change, specific to Colorado. So I got back from the hike and I started researching what's going on with climate change in our ecosystems. And it turns out there are probably 100 papers that have been published about it. And mostly, within the universities here at CSU and CU and the Forest Service and a few other places. And so just kind of a little teaser here. The major science findings are effects on forests, specifically related to wildfire and beetles, and I'll talk a little bit about mitigation of fire and what that means for the forest, and also effects on wildlife, and I'll talk a bit about apex predators, and also importantly, effects on hydrologic systems gone haywire. And I also personally am of Lakota Sioux in ancestry, and Chief Uray of the Utes was a big factor in the area of the Colorado Trail. Most of that land that the Colorado Trail traverses was Ute territory. In fact, as you go along through the trail, you pass Uray Peak and also Chipeta Peak, and Chipeta was his wife. And they're two big 13ers along the trail. I'll also go, as I go along, I want to put in a plug for public lands and wilderness. The book talks about mining and grazing and forest structure change and population growth. And so it's a story of all of those things. So here is the Colorado Trail in the upper northeast corner. It says near Castle Rock. It's actually Waterton Canyon. I'm sure lots of you have been there, and probably a lot of you have been on the Colorado Trail. And it heads westerly up into the Pike National Forest, through the Lost Creek Wilderness, up towards Breckenridge. Then it starts heading south, and it goes through the Mount Massive Wilderness and the Collegiate Peaks Wilderness, and past a bunch of the Collegiate Peaks, and then it crosses Monarch Pass in a couple of places. There's an East Collegiate here on the right side, and on the left side, there's the West Collegiate loop. So you can kind of choose your route there. A lot of people take the west one because it's more scenic. And then it kind of heads north or southwesterly down towards the San Juans and Eddiesville, San Luis Peak, Spring Creek Pass, which some of you are probably familiar with. Here's Lake City, Silverton, and on over Mullis Pass and down to Durango. So that's a quick kind of view of what we're talking about. So kind of by way of introduction, and I'm going to be relatively brief here. Probably I'm going to try to keep it to 30 minutes. Should be timing myself. There's a difference between weather and climate. And people tend to confuse those, especially people who aren't informed about climate change. Weather is, what was the weather today, this week, maybe this month. But when you start talking at longer views and averages, say for a year or a decade or a century, that's climate. And you can actually Google climate history for almost any area online, and you can get averages for almost any city and other major features like mountain passes and so forth. And they'll give you, so sorry about that. The next thing then is, so there's a difference there. Make sure. One moment. I apologize for that. Okay, so back to temperature. You probably have heard various places that we've been in a westwide mega drought for 1,200 years based on scientists' study of dendrochronology, which is tree ring data, and sediment cores and glacial cores, all sorts of markers of the drought for over 1,000 years. There are some more recent projections for Western Colorado of an increase of 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2025 relative to about 1970. And as we'll see, some of that's actually already happened, and potentially 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2090. And you might think, well, that's not a lot. But from an ecological standpoint, it is very significant. Precipitation. Although the models, and I'll show some modeling here in a minute, um, some of the studies that I have found in the scientific literature are projecting low to no snowpack in 35 to 60 years. Imagine our Colorado Rockies with no snowpack. Not only what it might look like or be like for the ecosystems, but think of agriculture, think of our water supplies for our cities, think of how that is going to potentially drastically affect our entire lives and our children's lives. Recently, weather, and I'm talking here 1 year, 2 years. In 2020, when I hiked, and also 2021, Colorado was mostly in extreme drought. You might remember the big fires I'll touch on a little bit later. Um, of course, the winter last year, the snowpack was well over average, which was great to see. I think we're running about average right now, maybe slightly ahead of average. And something about the Colorado Trail is that it's really a water fountain in the sky. It's the watersheds for the Rio Grande and the Colorado River, and also some of the major tributaries of those, like the Animas and the Gunnison, um, are two more fairly major rivers that all have their watersheds, their upper watersheds along the Colorado Trail. And the Colorado River, as you've probably heard a lot in our news lately, it serves over 40 million people in the Southwest. It's been in a crisis situation, especially, like I mentioned, the snowpack wasn't so bad last year, but prior to that, there were historic low flows and low amounts of water in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And the other thing is that the snowpack, if we don't have the reflective snowpack, we lack the albedo effect. And albedo has to do with the sunlight reflecting off of the snowpack and going back up into the sky. And that tends to make the snowpack last a lot longer if it's there. And if it's not there, you have the dark soil, which tends to melt what little bit of soil there is. So this is a map of some modeling that was done for the Pike National Forest by the National Forest. And basically, if you can see my cursor on here, this is the Pike National Forest up here, and this is the San Isabel National Forest down in here. And they're managed by the same managers, so they're kind of lumped together. As Claude mentioned, this is the area, really all of this area is area that Wild Connections is working in and has been working in for many years to get more conservation accomplished and lands protected. So if you look at the legend down here, this is average temperature, absolute change 1975 to 2005 versus 2071 to 2090. And this is the ICC report, reasonable expectations, the business as usual amount of greenhouse gases. It's the RCP 8.5. These are in degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. And it's hard to see. I know the colors are really a poor choice on their part, but basically, this is out here in the eastern plains of Colorado, is the lighter colors. So probably 4.6 to 4.7-ish. And there's not a lot of difference here in these numbers, but there's a change in the shading here. Uh, 2090, which is what, 50 years away, we might be looking at potentially up to 5 degrees Celsius changes, which in Fahrenheit, that's roughly twice that. This is precipitation, the same group of modelers, and again, the shading's pretty awful. It's not really a major difference for the area that we're looking in. Uh, Down in the San Juans, there might be actually, it's greener here, it might be more precipitation. But the precipitation, I think, and others scientists believe, is going to be more as rain and less as snowpack. So that's what's going on climate-wise, what the future might look like. This is back actually to the present and going back to about 2002. This is the Hayman wildfire burn. And I know some of the Wild Connections people have been up in here and seen this. This forest is not regenerating. It's ponderosa pine forest, and the areas that burned really are showing no revegetation of conifers. These areas off here to the right did not burn, and they're still healthy. So let's talk about fire and forest for a moment. So there's been an altered forest structure due to harvesting. So think about most of Colorado is on the second or third cut, meaning that the Front Range and the Central Mountains were largely harvested for mining once or twice, and we might even be in our third harvest. And so what happens is that makes the regrowth kind of a uniform age and size. Instead of having lots, some big trees and some little trees, they tend to be all kind of young and just overgrown to the point where some places lodgepole pine is called doghair lodgepole because you can't even walk through it. And the fire exclusion is part of that, Smokey the Bear and everything. The Forest Service has tried to put out fires for the last 75 years as much as possible. And so there's a lot of dead timber on the floor and standing, which creates a lot overload of fuel. Problem is Forest Service is still doing clear cuts in the name of fuels mitigation. So they're doing those clear cuts out there. It's still going on. And really what they should be doing, in my opinion and scientists' opinion, who are concerned about climate change and wildfire mitigation, is to thin the small trees and leave the large trees. But that's not economical really for people who make their lives by cutting timber. Here's a point, the Colorado forests no longer are sequestering carbon. They're not a carbon sink anymore. They're now a net carbon emitter. That's a pretty scary thought. We have all this forest in Colorado, and because of wildfires and beetle kill, a lot of this dead wood is now surpassing the amount of carbon that was sequestered. As I mentioned, those low elevation forests like Hayman and all up and down the Front Range, Boulder County, all over the Front Range are not regenerating. These are ponderosa pine forests that the pines are not coming back. And especially when the fire severity was high, and we get those in those big megafires. Megafires are defined by scientists as greater than 100,000 acres. So back to my hike. It started in 2020. There were very dry conditions. This was during the pandemic. And towards the end of that year, the fall, the East Troublesome Creek and the Cameron Peak fires took off. And another one besides that down in southern Colorado burned over 700,000 acres. So to put that in perspective, historically, from the 60s to the 90s, Colorado averaged about 20,000 acres per year. In the 2000s, from 2000 to 2010, it was up to about 85,000 acres per year on average. In the 2010s and the teens, averaged about 100,000 acres per year. So that would have been bringing us up to about, say, 2020, and boom, we get 700,000. My point is that if that were to continue, and I hope it doesn't, 700,000 acres per year in a decade equals 7 million acres. Colorado only has 24 million acres as forest. And so that's not really sustainable. In 2022 and 2023, the amount of wildfires were much lower because of wetter seasons. And finally, the fire season now is year-round. So as you continue along the Colorado Trail, especially getting from Monarch Pass and beyond, you see a lot of this dead forest. I probably went through 100 miles of forest that was dead and dying. And that's a lot different from when I went through this same area in 2008. So that was pretty depressing to see that. So the other thing besides wildfire that's going on are these bark beetles. And just to touch on it quickly, we have the pine beetle and we have the spruce bark beetle. Very small, they bore into the trees, into the cambium layer and lay their eggs. And the tree tries to flush out the eggs with sap, but too many of the beetles will cause the tree to die. A fungus comes in and kind of gives the coup de grace and takes out the trees. What used to be a 2-year life cycle now, because of warmer winters, is now a 1-year cycle, and that equals more beetles. Spruce bark beetle is more of a problem in the southwestern part of the state, and it's an enormous problem. If you've driven over Wolf Creek Pass, most of the forest there is dying from spruce beetle. In fact, it's the single largest source of forest mortality in the state. 40% of the San Juan National Forest is dead or dying from spruce beetle, and almost the same numbers in the Rio Grande National Forest. So here's a question for you. Do you think beetle-killed forests are a greater fire hazard? And what's going to happen from regeneration-wise? And what does that mean for biodiversity? The answers are not what you might think. Actually, the killed forests are probably a lesser fire hazard because the needles are gone compared to a very, very dry forest where the needles are, their moisture level is down to almost nothing, and there's terpenes and other sap in the wood and in the needles, and they just are highly, highly flammable. So scientists actually think the beetle-killed forests are not a greater fire hazard than the regular forest. They're not regenerating, at least not in the ponderosa pine lower elevation forests. And you might think biodiversity is harmed. Actually, there's a lot more shrubs and wildflowers and birds and bees and pollinators in a burned over forest once the understory starts recovering. Here's some more pictures that I took down in the San Juans. The first picture, it's a little hard to tell, but all this kind of grayish, light brown stuff are dead trees. There's some green in here, which makes it a little hard to tell. And looking at the picture down below, those trees are almost all dead. Those are spruce trees, Engelmann spruce. You will see a few living ones in there, but when the trees get large enough, they're being killed by the beetle. So what about wildlife? There's effects on phenology, which has to do with bloom time for vascular plants. Research at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab is finding the plants are blooming earlier and they're out of sync with pollinators, with bees and hummingbirds and so forth. In fact, the pollinators themselves are declining everywhere in the country, but especially in the mountains. For instance, the western bumblebee populations, which you might have seen in the mountains often, they're kind of the smaller bumblebee, are down over 70% in their abundance. And the bird situation is awful too. Throughout the USA, bird populations are down 3 billion. Some of it's climate change, but there are other factors: development, pesticides, migration routes where there's habitat damage. Wild Connections did some banding for brown-capped rosy finches. They've declined by 95%, and the main culprit there is being pointed at climate change. There aren't enough insects for these birds. is the main problem. Small mammal ranges are shifting upward. A study by CU Boulder has found that on average, they trapped a lot of small mammals, that they have moved up by 430 feet over the years. Pikas were thought to be vulnerable, but actually maybe they're being shown to be more adaptable than we thought. But what about lynx, snowshoe hares, wolverine, moose, cutthroat trout, and bats? They're all very vulnerable to climate change. And I always put in a little plug for apex predators to help regulate the deer and elk, which are not really harmed by climate change. They're very adaptable and they will always be here. Beaver, we need more beavers, and Wild Connections has been active in trying to get beavers reestablished. Colorado has grown, as you've all seen. Um, it's, it's we're almost at 6 million people, and it was a little over 1 million people in my lifetime, and actually in my adult lifetime, 50 years ago when I came to Colorado. So that's like a five-fold increase in 50 years. And they're projected to add, we are projected to add another 680,000 by 2030. And so all of our trails and recreation, mountain recreation, skiing, you name it, whatever you do in the mountains for outdoor recreation is getting more crowded, there's more impact. And people are living in this wildland urban interface. And that's the lower elevation forest, which is very risky from wildfire. And so there are great safety and property considerations. We even finding with the Marshall Fire that it's not just forest, but grasslands can be uh, part of the wildland urban interface. A lot of the Marshall Fire came from grasslands were undeveloped, although the ignition sources were probably human caused. So we need wildfire mitigation, especially in the WUI and the low elevation forests. Thinning, if it's done properly, is a good thing. If it's not done properly, it's not a good thing. As I mentioned, the Forest Service is doing clear cuts and they're calling it fuels mitigation. And really, that's not the way to do it. In fact, that method creates more carbon emissions and is less ecologically sustainable. More than 100 scientists signed a letter to the president when the infrastructure bill was being passed, or the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it was, to not go crazy about wildfire mitigation. And really what they mean is logging. So that's the danger, is that that's going to be what the Forest Service does. Prescribed fire is better ecologically, and it's especially good after a thinning effort. And thinning is expensive. So what do we do? So I'm almost ready to wrap up here. This is an example of the high altitude trails along the Colorado Trail. No forest up here, unbelievably beautiful, except for when it's raining in the monsoon season, which is much of the summer. So read with me here. So, so basically, this is a potential future of our ecosystems. And I'm not joking, this is backed up by over 100 papers. So this is a last little quote out of the book that I'd like to read, but this is in my way here. So I'm getting some blockage from these. There we go. The Colorado Trail is the signature trail in the state and one of the best long trails in the country. In fact, it's, as a parenthetical thought here or comment, it's the highest elevation long trail in our nation. It will endure as long as hikers seek refuge and solace from our complicated lives, as long as good people like the Colorado Trail Foundation and its volunteers and donors are willing to maintain it, and as long as we remain vigilant in protecting our public lands. The ecology of the trail will change in the coming decades, but it will still offer beauty and solace to its pilgrims. I think about my kids and my grandkids. The trail will still be there, but it's going to be different. So if you're interested in the book, I have some copies. I'm selling them at paperback versions for 15, hardback for 46. That includes shipping. If you want to buy a book, send me a check to this number or this address. And I'm going to make a donation to Wild Connections for every book sold through me. And I encourage you to make donations to Wild Connections. It's a really good organization. Check out their website. And you can also get the book from the online from the publisher, the University Press of Colorado. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Allison, and we'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Karl. I'll give people a chance to put questions into the chat, or they can unmute themselves if they prefer. I also have some a presentation about some work that Wild Connections is doing related to climate change that was inspired by work that Karl has done.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so Carl had mentioned that the best way for the mitigation for wildfires would be through thinning of the smaller trees rather than the larger trees. And I guess that's being done through logging. It's probably, like he said, less expensive to log and cut the bigger trees and remove them, but the correct way would be to do it through the thinning of the smaller trees. I would imagine that the scientists have had this discussion with the property management for BLM. So what are they moving in that direction from a ecological perspective to help mitigate rather than destroy the trees? Are they understanding that, I guess, is my question.
So when I went through on the Colorado Trail hike, and also on some of my other travels around the state, they're still clear cutting.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to leave the mother trees, the older trees, to reproduce. They go back and they try to revegetate and plant little seedlings, and they just get baked alive. We tried that at the Hayman fire.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no canopy cover, there's nothing to protect them from drying out and dying. And
Yeah.
So really, you need to leave the big trees and thin the little ones. And if you've been ever hiked through a thin before, you see these big piles of slash. And those are fire hazards because that's a lot of fuel in one place. And all it takes is one crazy person to start one off. And they really need to remove the slash or burn the slash. And it's also ideal if you do prescribed fire after you thin, because that tends uh, to kill more of the seed bed. And it doesn't kill them all. The pines tend to have serotinous cones, which actually can survive a low severity fire. But prescribed fire after a thinning operation removes a lot of the small branches and litter and debris that the loggers leave. And thinning is very expensive. It costs more than logging. Loggers want to come in and they'll actually pay the Forest Service for the logs. But on a thinning operation, it's all the Forest Service paying out contractors. And there's not a lot of salvage available. A little bit for firewood, but not a lot. So that's the conundrum that they're having. And it's a funding issue more than anything else. The Inflation Reduction Bill has a lot of money for Forest Service to do more of this work. And hopefully they'll start to do a better job of it.
Thank you, Carl. I will mention that the Biden administration put out an executive order to try to protect mature and old growth forests, and the Forest Service is starting to respond to this with some protections focusing mostly on old growth forests. They need to be strengthened to also protect mature forests, because old growth forests can only happen if mature forest can only expand if mature forests are not logged or developed in other ways. There are some other comments and questions in the chat. Let me first of all read a comment from Ida. Said, thank you. We try to hike in the forest often and they remain a respite. Then I have a question from Kristen. Carl, in the future scenario you listed at the end, please describe how animal species are changing.
So the pollinators are in trouble. Cutthroat trout are in trouble. The streams are warming and drying out, and the flows are low when we have these big droughts and wildfires. And when we get wildfires, a lot of mud flows get into the rivers and streams and affect the fisheries. As far as mammals, I think I named some of the ones that sort of the charismatic megafauna that we think of, that for Colorado, moose, lynx. Colorado now is talking about reintroducing wolverine. Wolverines like cold, snowy, high mountains. And if we lose our snowpack, the lynx and the wolverines and the snowshoe hares are going to go away. So, you know, and moose. Moose also are very cold adapted, and they like mid to high elevations. They do come down a little bit in the winter, but they stay up there in the snow. And that's just their ecological niche. So, you know, there are some vulnerable species and there are species that are very generalist. Some of the predators, coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, black bears, they'll be fine because they'll eat almost anything. And there's always going to be plenty of deer and elk. Bighorn sheep, probably, you know, we have a pretty sketchy population statewide. And they're subject to problems from domestic sheep, and climate change is not going to help them either. So, you know, just think about vulnerable versus more adaptable species. They're going to be winners and losers.
Okay, have someone has had their hands raised. Let me
I see a question. What do you think of the idea of using forest for biomass? So there has been talk about that, basically taking the wood from these thinning projects and putting them into burners and making steam, which can be used to make electricity. And that's been done for years in some places on a small scale. And maybe you might be more familiar than me about whether or not there's any larger scale biomass operations in Colorado. I'm not aware of any.
Hey,
Next
Carl,
question.
that was my question, and one of the reasons I was asking was I saw a presentation last week suggesting that biomass might be an alternative, and they're suggesting that you take out the older trees, the younger trees will grow faster, and that will mitigate climate change impacts. And I have a feeling, and whether that's true or not depends on what you do with the wood. If you just burn it and put it up in the air, then it's not going to be any mitigation at all.
There's also possibilities of making biogas out of it by chipping it into small or making sawdust and gasifying it. Again, nothing on any significant scale in Colorado that I know of. Maybe up in Oregon where they have, real forests, big forests, and California, Washington State. Here's one about novel financing strategies for wildfire mitigation. And it suggests www.blueforest.org.
Okay, and Jeer, is that how I pronounce your name? Please go
Jerry,
ahead.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is Jerry. Yeah, I'm new to this, and I don't know if I'm being naive or not, but I mean, I've been very concerned listening to what appears to be happening to our forests in Colorado. And I grew up just assuming that the Forest Service knows what they're doing. After all, they were charged with maintaining and sustaining our forests as the Forest Service. Are you saying that that the Forest Service does not agree with these scientific recommendations on how to maintain forests in a healthy state? Or is there still a lack of consensus? Or are they going against their own scientific knowledge and simply acting to political or economic pressure? I mean, why are they not already doing this?
That's a good question. I'd say it's all of those things. I worked for BLM for 20 years, and public land managers are very sensitive to local economic conditions, jobs in the woods kind of thing, or BLM, we don't have as many woods, we have oil and gas and mining, etc. So there's always these pressures to exploit the natural resources. And managers, they have a multiple use mission, and they're told to manage the forest or the resource for multiple use sustained yield kind of thing. And just look at how they've managed the forest for the last 75 or 100 years with all the forest fire suppression. I mean, yes, suppression is good when you've got cities and towns and villages and people living in the WUI, but it isn't necessary to put every fire out. That's why they usually let fires in wilderness areas burn, or roadless areas, let them burn. And to be honest with you, these mega fires, we can't fight them anyway. They're going to burn until they burn themselves out, and the weather causes the fire to go out. That's what happened with East Troublesome Creek and with Cameron Peaks Fire and fires in California, in Canada, and throughout the Northwest. These mega fires are just, we're spending tons and tons of money trying to save real estate, but that's the best that you can do. And as far as wildfire mitigation, I think it's, they haven't really listened to the scientists, or they're just getting around to it. So in my book, I talked about the letter that 100 of the top scientists in this field sent to the president during the Inflation Reduction Act, basically telling him that thinning is being currently done by the Forest Service. What they call thinning is really not working, and in fact, it's creating more carbon in the atmosphere than it's taking away. Because as those dead trees decompose, they release the CO2 into the air, or if they burn, they release the CO2 into the air. So there's a safety issue, and then there's a climate issue, and sometimes they get all tangled up. It's not an easy job managing these resources.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
One other thought is to remember that the U.S. Forest Service is under the United States Department of Agriculture. So it started as an agency whose primary goal was to produce wood, just as farmers produce wheat or corn. And through the years, they've changed to have the multiple use mandate. But their funding sources have been drying up, and as Karl mentioned, it can be more expensive to do thinning than to do clear cutting. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and talk a little bit about Wild Connections climate planning project. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Thank you very much, Karl, for that great.
And thank you all.
Okay, Karl inspired Wild Connections to expand our planning and advocacy work to focus on climate resilience and not simply on the places that were currently the most important for wildlife. So our goal of the Central Colorado Climate Resilience Project has been to identify and protect places in the Wild Connections region where biodiversity will thrive under the changing climate conditions. So let me define some of these terms. First of all, Karl's already done a good job of explaining climate change. Just wanted to share this map that was part of a series done by the Washington Post, and it's showing that parts of Colorado had significant temperature changes already by 2019, and quite a few years have passed, about 5 years have passed since then. However, there are parts of Colorado where the climate has not changed as much. So what is climate resilience? Here's a definition from the IPCC. And the part that's significant for Wild Connections is allowing ecosystems to cope with the changing climate and to in ways that maintain biodiversity as well as other characteristics. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is a variety of native species, and it can be defined in different ways as shown on this slide. It can be the total number of species, the diversity, genetic diversity within the individual species can mean having species that occur in a region and nowhere else in the world, which is true in many parts of Colorado. There can be unique ecosystems that don't appear elsewhere in the world or are rare elsewhere in the world. And then there's the number of ecosystems in a region. And as the climate changes, there will be areas that will remain rich in biodiversity. In some cases, it'll be the same species, the same animals and plants that were there in the past. In other cases, these animals and plants that are in a place may change, but it will continue to have a wide variety of species. And it can be in places where there's a lot of water, where there's good canopy. There's a concept of cold air pools, so a phenomena where in mountain valleys, the temperatures stay fairly steady because the cold air can't drain away. And any area that has a lot of topological complexities, so where there are a lot of different slopes that face different directions, where there are a lot of canyons, those are places where the temperatures change more slowly. So very quickly, here's the Wild Connections region. So this is part of central Colorado down to the southern part of the state. So all east of the Continental Divide, includes the headwaters of the South Platte River and the Arkansas River. And it includes lands managed by the Forest Service, so the Pike and the San Isabel National Forests. Also includes lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management, especially along the Arkansas River. There's lands managed by the state of Colorado in our region, and there's lands, private lands that have protections as well. So over the last, I'm not even sure how long, it's probably getting close to 10 years, Wild Connections started and completed a project to identify areas in our region where we expect that biodiversity will persist. And these are shown on this map in various shades of green. It's also important for climate resilience that there are pathways for animals to move, either for their seasonal migrations and for the dispersal of young, but also if their habitat is changing, if the places where they can thrive are moving uphill, for example, they need to have pathways to get to these new places. And areas that our models showed were important are shown in this map in brown, and some of the brown areas are also areas that we expect will have good, will serve as climate refugia, will have good climate resilience. Gonna mention two different places where we have applied this. Browns Canyon is an area between Salida and Buena Vista along the Arkansas River on the eastern side of the Arkansas Valley. It's a national monument. It's an area that's very important to me. I started mapping it over 20 years ago, before it was a national monument. On this map, there's areas in shades of green, which are managed by the Forest Service. Areas in shades of yellow and orange are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Excuse me. And the brighter colors, the orange is a wilderness study area, and the darker green are roadless areas managed by the Forest Service. And according to our model, the wilderness study area is good as a climate refugia. We did a scale that goes from fair to better to best. Good, fair, good, better, and best. Aspen Ridge area, which is the Forest Service, is one of the best areas for ecological connectivity. And we did some climate education event along with the Friends of Browns Canyon last autumn that was well attended. Another area is called High Mesa Grasslands or Table Mountain. And Wild Connections is working with the Bureau of Land Management to try to get this designated as a wilderness study area. Wild Connections has made the request. The Bureau of Land Management was very busy updating their plan for Eastern Colorado. They've completed that now, so we're hoping they can take on this project. This is an area along the Arkansas River that's between Canyon City and Salida. So Canyon City is to the east and the Royal Gorge, and Salida is to the west. It's across the river from the McIntyre Hills wilderness study area. There's a very small area that was designated as a wilderness study area. A wilderness study area, by the way, is an area that has not been congressionally designated as wilderness, but as long as it remains a wilderness study area, it is managed as if it were wilderness. And there have been multiple proposals to try to get areas in Browns Canyon and to get this area, the Table Mountain area or the High Mesa Grasslands area designated as wilderness. This is a area of over 23,000 acres. It's rated good as a climate refugia and for ecological connectivity, and better for its natural landscape and current biodiversity. And these facts were included in the petition that Wild Connections made to the Bureau of Land Management to protect this area. So where are we with our climate planning project? We've completed the geospatial modeling that's been complete now for several years. We are using this information to identify areas for climate education. And we're using this information to promote additional wilderness study areas and areas of critical environmental concern, and to target other proposals for protection. Wild Connections was formed many years ago to help guide the Forest Service in updating their plan for the Pike San Isabel National Forest. That still hasn't started, but when it gets going, Wild Connections will be ready. We're hoping this summer to be presenting the results of this project to land management agencies. There's a new leader for the Pike San Isabel Forest, a new regional forester, so that will be a good person to bring this information to. And we have good relationship with the Bureau of Land Management as well. So thank you, everyone. Here are some information for how to contact us. By the way, I never really introduced myself. I'm Alison Gallensky. as I said, I've been a long time volunteer with Wild Connections. That inspired me, my volunteer work, to move from being a software developer into a GIS, geospatial mapper and analyst. And I work at an organization called Rocky Mountain Wild, where I do geospatial analysis. So let me stop this and give folks, thank you everyone for staying on. If anyone has any questions, if anyone's available to stay on for a few more minutes, we'd be happy to answer them. And I encourage anyone who's not familiar with Wild Connections to learn more about our organization.
Thank you, Alison. It's Claude Newman. I have one more question for Karl. And Karl, I'm wondering what science has indicated is the reason for lack of regeneration, especially in the ponderosa pine forest. Is that just general drought, where there's just not enough water to support regeneration, or is it the soil got burned so badly? Do you have any insight onto why that's happening?
Yeah, so these were high severity burns, which means the soil was, some people say, quote, sterilized. I mean, the soil was burned so badly that it was damaged, and the seedbed was totally destroyed. And so like the Hayman fire, for instance, which for many years was the largest one in Colorado, over 100,000 acres, as I recall. And I've been out there, and it's hotter than blazes out there. There's no canopy, no shade. So even if a little seedling gets started in the springtime, germinates, it's likely to die because it's so hot and dry. And, you know, that's just the way it's been. And it's not just the Hayman. It's a number of the burn scars throughout the Front Range in the lower montane ponderosa pine zone are not regenerating. I think the higher elevation forests will, like the Cameron Peaks and the East Troublesome Creek fire. Those are lodgepole pine and some up into the spruce fir, subalpine. Because of the higher moisture levels and the fact that it wasn't a complete high severity burn in all places, it was spotty, but in many places, it's going to regenerate. In fact, I've been up to the East Troublesome Creek area in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I've seen thousands of lodgepole coming up in some places and zero coming up in other places.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alison.
So there's a question in the chat from Kristen. Where can we find the information to order the book from Karl and support Wild Connections at the same time? Kristen, do you have an answer to your question?
Yeah, I showed if I can share my screen again. Let me show you my address. Share and go to the end here. So this is a mailbox I use. If you want to send a check, I will send it back to you and cover the shipping at this price. Or you can also buy it from universitypressofcolorado.com. And it's going to start getting into the bookstores, I hope. I'm doing a talk at the Tattered Cover in South Denver, Littleton, whatever. And I'm going to try to hit some other bookstores and libraries around the state.
You look forward to that, and maybe Kristen can help us to get this information onto the Wild Connections webpage as well. And there was one more question in the chat. Or Jared, do you want to go ahead and ask? So the question.
I'm sorry, I was going back to the prior conversation about the what I gather was the failure of trees to regenerate, or are we also talking about grasses and all? In other words, would these high burn areas be able to thrive as open grasslands in the future, or are they sterile to all types of vegetation?
Yeah, so the Hayman fire is a good example because it's now 22 years old. And if you head out there on some of the Forest Service roads, in fact, Wild Connections that leads trips out into this area like a Wildcat Canyon, you drive through the burn area to get there. But there's a lot of shrubs coming up and a lot of wildflowers and grasses. They are recovering. Some aspen in the wetter areas as well.
So if the forests are not regenerating, they are regenerating those areas into a different type of landscape?
Yes. In fact, ecologists have names for these kinds of landscapes. I just use the common names like grasslands or shrublands. And that's, I think, probably the future of these lower elevation burns along the Front Range.
So there may be a mixture of losses and gains in the sum of these impacts in the future that
It's,
what we lost, we may also, on the other hand, be gaining in different types of habitat for different types of wildlife or other life.
That's very correct. So you're going to see more pollinators and more small mammals and more birds because of all of the understory growth that is happening there. When you get into like a lodgepole pine forest, a mature one, if you've noticed, there's like very little understory and there's not much going on there from biodiversity standpoint. But these open up areas are great for deer and elk. There's lots of stuff for them to eat and predators follow them. So, you know, it's going to be different, but it's going to still be beautiful in its own way.
All right, well, thank you. That was my question.
Thank you, Carl. And based on our research, there will be areas where biodiversity will persist, especially if we protect those areas and don't do unnecessary logging in those areas or don't develop them for intensive recreation. And that's something that Wild Connections is working on in our region, and many organizations are taking on throughout the state. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recordings.